Hello there. My name is LaVar Davis. I'm one of the application engineers from the North American region in ATS for CM4D, and welcome to some basic training for DataSmith. In this module, we'll look at some DataSmith operations. We'll see how we can load files that need to be translated through the DataSmith module and have its information uploaded into the CM4D database. So from other parts of the series, you've probably seen an overview of CM4D, the different applications and suites that are involved in producing working reports that engineers and others can analyze based on measurement data that is created at the plant or at supplier level. And here in this illustration, which is found at atshelp.com under version 21, I'm kind of showing a data flow concept for the DataSmith module of CM4D. So it's the one here in green. As you can see, it's illustrating how nominal data and actual data can be taken and loaded into the DataSmith module. Its information will be scanned and loaded into the CM4D database, which will then make it available for creating reports in CM4D Classic, CM4D Interactive, or in the newer versions, it'll also allow for data to be loaded into the results database and be used in applications such as Tableau, Power BI, and other applications that can interface with that new SQL database. But for this module, what we'll do is look at an example of a data file being loaded into DataSmith and having its nominal data and actual data scanned and loaded into the database. So to do that, I have some training data here on this training resource, this VM, which you can see above, Dml CM4DS2.ats-global.local. Created some training data and folders that we'll be working out of as we do this, right here in the CM4D training folder on the C drive. And I have some data that we're going to be using. If I go into here, the data folder, I have here training part, and we have this DMO and TMP information. So we'll see why that's split up. But first what we'll do is see that we have this one file called a Dml file. This is a typical or very common form of output that comes from CMM measurement devices and other similar devices. If I open up the file here, we see that within the file you have what's known as a header area, where you have information about the measurements themselves. For instance, maybe the part number, which is known here under project. You might have information about who the data collector was, important information like the time and date that this entire file was created, or when the measurement took place. And then you might have other forms of information. Here we have units, work plan, and maybe some other tags that might help to organize this later on when this is in the database. For instance, operator, CMM ID, machine ID. All of that will change based on whatever the preferences are for the plant. But in general, the things that we really need are what's known as the part number, which again would be what's known as the routine code, or the routine, which is the unique ID that all of these measured values would be known under. You would have something like a part number, which could be the time and date put together, which is unique ID for this particular collection of checks. And then you have other pieces of information in here, like operator, shift, machine ID, which again can be used to help organize or do search operations for a collection of samples once you're in the CM4D classic software. So yeah, we have the header section of the file, which tells us about the file itself. And then we have the information in the file, which are the measured values that were analyzed or measured by the collection device. So that's where we see this output F, and then in parentheses we have what's known as the feature name, which is the unique name for a particular location. If you notice, they have here under or after the word Cartesian or CART, they have X, Y, and Z information. So X, Y, and Z nominal, and then it looks like they have tolerances here for the X, Y, and Z nominals, and that just repeats itself throughout this file. So that's just a brief overview of the content of this file. We'll look into more detail when we get into the software itself. So if we want to create a translator for this, what we can do is start the DataSmith program. And if we're going to do this from scratch as an example, what we'll do is go to File and choose New. What this does is create a new DataSmith translator file that's blank. At this point, what we could do is save this off, since we'll be making modifications to it. I can say Save As, and what I'll do is go to the training folder that I created. I'm going to go under a folder I made just for these types of files called DataSmith Translators. As you see, I have one there already that has some complete translators for what we're about to go over. So that can be used as a reference later. But what I'll do is call this under my name. Now the format here can be pretty much anything you want. I'm just trying to name it something that is relatable or that gives me information about what I'm loading. So I'll save that. And then since this is a completely new document, if you notice here we have these different sections for header, footer, features, comments, and validations. If I expand each one, it will have an instruction section, and then under that, characteristics. We'll look more into what we do with this, what the instructions and what the characteristics are for. But just note that you start off with some predefined sections here, and these will correspond to the different major areas of the file that we looked at, the DMO file. So in order to actually load that DMO file into this translator, what we can do is click here on Add Files, and I will go to where that file was, which was data training part DMO nominal file. And I'm going to load this file by hitting open, and it loads it into this brand new translator. So if you notice, the file is completely blank as I scroll through, but it's showing us the formatting or the content of this file. So, in order to start developing, there are basically 4 steps that we need to do whenever we are working within DataSmith. So I'll just describe those 4 here. First thing we do is using the instructions that we will see how to modify. We will go to beginning of whatever it is that we want to scan. The second thing we do is we start scanning. I can also say start scanning by creating beginning mark. Step 3 is we go to the end of whatever data we want to scan. Step 4 is we stop marking the data within end mark. So we'll see exactly what this means. For instance, we notice we have, again, a header area that starts at the beginning of the file. This header looks like it extends down to this line where it says production trial. I know this is the header because it's at the beginning of the file 1 and 2. It has information that is about the rest of the content in the file. So if you notice, there is a header area here that's predefined. This is where we would write instructions to scan this header area. And basically what instructions do is they tell the software how to move within the file step by step based off of what is consistent within the file. So it's based off the internal formatting. And when we write the instructions here where it says undefined, we'll be following these 4 steps in general, which is going to the beginning of where data is, starting the scanning operation, going to the end of the data, and then stopping the scanning operation. So for instance, here in the header section, if I double click on this first instruction where it says undefined, it is going to create what's known as an instruction bar, which appears here down below. So in this bar, I can click where it says undefined, and I can choose a particular word which will start a sentence that tells the software what to do for this instruction. So what I would want to do is say go to, and then if you notice after I click that, I get more instructions, or I have a complete sentence. Every time I see a drop down, I can edit this sentence in order to get a complete phrase. So what I want to do is say go to beginning, and if I click on the drop down here, I have more options. Say line. So once I do that, if I hit this button here called commit, that will cement this one instruction. And the cursor within the software will now be at the beginning of the file, right in front of the letter F here. So once that's done, I can click on the next instruction underneath, and again, it'll say undefined. What I can do is click and again tell it to do the next instruction, which would be mark current position as begin. So if you notice, there are a lot of different instruction types here. Some are for moving within the file, some are for searching, some are for doing actions like marking or assigning maybe a value. So instead of finding something in the file, it will tell the software what the value would be. The list of these are also here at the ATSHelp.com location for all the different versions of CM4D. I just want to show that real quick. I can go to Applications, DataSmith, Instructions, and in here it's going to give you all the different combinations for the instructions and what each header or beginning instruction means. So again, you have locate, move to. Locate is when you're looking for something specific like period, space, comma, tab. Move to lets you move a certain number of characters left and right or up and down. Go to is always going to the beginning and ending of a section, file, or marking that you've created. Search for allows you to search for a particular string of characters a certain number of times, which again we'll see more examples of as we create the translator. And then mark is where we can do mark begin or mark end in order to scan data, or some other special types of marks like mark limits, bookmarks, or positions if you need to make a more complex translator. So again, a lot of what we're going to cover have their definitions here under ATSHelp.com, so it's a good resource to look for topics and get knowledge on those. But back to the instructions that we're doing here. We have go to the beginning of the line. The next thing I'll say is mark current position as begin. So that starts the marking operation. And the end of this header area looks like it will be here where it says production/trial. So in order to get to the end of this line, there's some assumptions that we need to make about the format of the file. So we look for what is consistent. So I'm going to assume that where it says production trial, it will always say that for all the DMO files that share this format. So if you have a collection device and it's measuring different parts throughout the day, different samples are measured, and then unique parts are measured as well, but they all come from the same collection device. They all should share the same internal formatting. And if that's the case, they should all have certain things in common from file to file. So the one thing I'm assuming here is that all those files would have production trial as the last line for the header. If that's the case, what I can do is a search function to get to that last line so that I'm on the right line, and then I'll do another instruction to get to the end of that line and then mark that as the end or ending mark, so I can capture all of the header information in one section. So to do that, I will click on this third instruction and say search for the next string, and I can type it as I see it here, production /trial. And I have here search for that string one time. So it's going to continue searching until it finds that once. It says do not ignore case, so I can change this to say ignore or do not ignore the spelling or the casing, whether it's upper or lower case, for the string that I put in here. I can say do not constrain, constrain to line or constrain to limits. I want to choose do not constrain because I want the search to not be limited just to this first line. I want it to scan throughout the file until it finds this phrase here. And then any character position, I want to keep it this way. If I chose one character, I could say from beginning or ending of line. That just means that it would limit the search for this phrase to this one character position. If I said two characters from beginning of line, it would mean it would look just within the second column, character column, for this phrase. So it's being very, very specific about where the search function happens. What I will do is say any character position. So with this, the cursor will look throughout the file until it finds production trial, and it will stop at the beginning of it. So right before the P. So if the cursor's there and I want to get to the end of this line, the next thing I can do is say go to end of the line. If I hit commit, then the cursor will be at the end of this line. And at that point, I can choose my last instruction, which is mark current position as end. And what that will do is let the software know there is a beginning mark and an ending mark, and it will mark everything in between as part of what's known as the header section. So as we've seen just briefly here, we've created a few instructions based on the internal format of this file in order to mark the header section within this file. So now that that's marked, the software will know that anything we pick up from this area will be part of this header section, or header information. So how do we actually pick up data from a header section, or from any section that we create? Well, what we'll have to do is create what's known as a characteristic. So this is how the different bits of data within your file are actually scanned in order to be loaded into the CM4D database. So a characteristic, again, is just one piece of information that will be loaded into the database. If we look at this header, I think we'll keep it simple for now. We have some things that are essential for creating a record in the database. The first thing that's essential or necessary is a routine name. So the routine name is a unique ID under which all of this information in this file will be known. So it will be the name of the record will be the unique ID for storing all of this information. So typically the routine would be something provided within the file that identifies the part name. So if you notice here where it says part number, we have a code here. So for this company, when they measure this particular collection of checks for a part or a sheet metal object, that part is identified with this code. So that's what we want to use as the routine name or routine label. So if we want to pick that up, what we can do is right click on characteristics, choose new characteristic, and within here it will create a new characteristic for us. If you notice, it's just a mini version of the major area under which it was created. So it has its own instruction set, which will only function within the area that is defined above it. So whatever we write or create for the instructions here, the scanning or searching will be limited to this header area. Starts off saying characteristic A, that's just a default option. We can change this so that we have a better idea of what we're going to pick up with it by right-clicking and choosing modify characteristic. And then we'll have this properties window that pops up. So here I can give it a name. I'll call this routine label. The name that we give here is simply for our ability to recognize what each characteristic we create is used for. So it's just a label for us. However, the software itself does not know exactly what it is that it's picking up or where to store it. So we can write instructions here and we can pick up what this code is, but the software won't know what to do with it until we associate it with a proper data type. So there's a button here called associate. This is actually pretty important here. This is how we tie what it is we know we want to get from the file to where it needs to go in the database. We're defining what we're picking up with associate. So if we click on this, it will take us to this associations window or tree, and it's broken up into three major parts: one for all routine associations, one for sample associations, and one for feature associations. So again, in previous training videos, sure, it was explained what the difference is between routine, sample, and feature. In this case, we want the routine label, so we're going to go to the routine area and click the expansion button. We have subcategories here. We're going to go to properties and expand that one. And within here, if you see these icons with a red bar and an arrow, these are the actual data types or definitions that are predefined within the software. And the one that we want to choose is label. So if you notice, when we click there where it says association selected, we'll have routine label. That is what's always going to be used whenever we're trying to pick up the unique ID that will identify the collection of checks represented within this file. So we're going to hit OK, and that will define the proper association for this characteristic for what we're going to pick up. There's other options here, but we'll get more into these a bit later, actually. So we'll hit OK. And with that, we have a proper characteristic defined. So now all we need to do is write instructions in order to pick up that piece of information, which is that unique ID or routine label, from this header file. So to do that, I'm going to click here on the first instruction. And the one thing I'll keep in mind is anytime you're looking at the first instruction of a characteristic, in your mind and in the software, the position of the cursor is always at the beginning of the section that you're in. So we're in the header section. Our cursor would be at the very beginning, right in front of the F. So our goal really right now is to get to this area and mark this information that is between these two commas on this line called part number. So there's different ways that we can do that. Since we're starting at the top, we could go down a certain number of lines to get to part number and then scroll over. But again, if we know that certain things are consistent within the file format, we can use that as we try to make our way to where the data is that we need to mark. So for instance, this routine name or label is on the same line as part number. So I will search for part number. I'll say search for next string part number, so that the cursor finds or looks through the file, finds part number, or stops at the beginning of it. We don't want to start marking from here because we don't want part number to be a part of that unique ID. We want to grab just the ID, which starts after that first looks like apostrophe or colon, and then at the end of the second colon. So what we will do after we do the first instruction will be here at this location. We want to get to where that number 1 is. We don't want to search for the number 1 itself because, again, in another DMO file, this could be a completely different part number. But we know that in all DMO files from this collection device, whatever appears here, even if they're all different, it will always be between the first and second quotes here. So what I will do is then say search for the next string, comma, or I'm sorry, not comma, the I believe it's the quote, single quote. So I'll put in one single quote and then hit commit. What that will do is make the software look on this line until it finds that first quote. So it's going to stop at the beginning. So I'm going to move over 1 character. So each of these strings, everything that you see is 1 character position. If I turn on the grid, you'll be able to see that better. At the top, there's an option for grid paper. If I turn that on, you'll see a grid superimposed onto the file here. And if you notice, each square is 1 character position. So when I do my search, it stops here at the edge of this square. I want to move just 1 over, so what I will say is move to the next character 1 time. At that point, I'll be right in front of the actual data I want to pick up. So the next thing I'll say is mark current position as begin. And then however long this string is, I just know that at the end of it there is another quote. So I will say search for the next string quote 1 more time. That will put me at the beginning of that, or at the end of the data that I want to mark, which is where I want to be. So the last thing I need is to stop marking, but I've run out of instructions. So what I can do is right click here on instructions and choose new instruction. You can do that as many times as you want. So you can do new instructions, you can copy a particular instruction, or you can paste between different areas, as we'll see in the file later on. Okay, so I have a new instruction. In this last one, I will say mark current position as end. And when I do that, it will highlight the beginning and ending area to let me know exactly what this instruction is picking up. And it will highlight it in the same color as this characteristic. So if I wanted the color for this to change so that you can kind of keep track of newer or more characteristics that you add later on, I can always right click, go to modify, bring back up the characteristic properties, and here where it says color, if I choose that, I can choose between a predetermined number of colors for this characteristic. So if I choose yellow, it will change this to yellow. Okay, so what we have done so far, again, is define a major area, the header area, and then we've defined a characteristic within that area. We've used instructions to define both. We've used what's known as associate to pick the correct data definition for what we're picking up for this routine label, and we've written the instructions so that it defines or always picks up the information in this area for this part number. So what we will do for the rest of the file is just a repeat of what we've done already here. It just depends on what other pieces of data you need to pick up and what we need to pick up for the features later on. So we will do that in the next part, and yeah, look forward to seeing you there for finishing this file.